During the brutal aerial campaigns of World War II, Allied gunners often faced a terrifying reality. The sky was full of enemy aircraft that seemed to appear out of nowhere, darting at speeds that made hitting them feel almost impossible. For the United States Army Air Forces (USAAF) gunners, the task was particularly daunting. Bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator were lumbering, heavily armored, and often loaded with crews inexperienced in aerial combat. Yet, the gunners manning their .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns were expected to fend off swarms of faster, more maneuverable German fighters. In the early days of the war, despite their courage, their effectiveness was limited. Enemy aircraft seemed to vanish before their sights, and many crews returned with stories of bullets that passed harmlessly through the air, hitting nothing. It wasn't that the gunners lacked skill. The problem was far more technical. Conventional aiming techniques were failing in the high-speed, three-dimensional chaos of air combat. Initially, U.S. gunners were trained to point their guns directly at enemy planes, leading targets only minimally, based on visual estimations of speed and distance. This direct fire method made sense in theory. If a fighter approached head-on or from slightly off to the side, a steady burst of bullets fired directly at it seemed like the most logical approach. But in practice, it was nearly useless against German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 or Focke-Wulf Fw 190, which were faster, smaller, and more agile than the lumbering Allied bombers they pursued. The enemy could often appear, fire, and vanish from the gunners' line of sight before they could even squeeze the trigger effectively. One of the most pressing problems was something that most people rarely consider when thinking about aerial combat: relative motion. Enemy fighters were not static targets. They moved in complex patterns, accelerating, turning, and diving at speeds that could exceed 350 miles per hour. Meanwhile, the bomber itself was moving, often at 200 to 250 miles per hour. For a gunner's aiming to hit a moving target with bullets that traveled around 2,800 feet per second, this created a difficult calculation. Any misjudgment in speed, angle, or distance could send bullets trailing harmlessly behind or ahead of the target. In the confusion of combat, gunners would instinctively aim directly at the fighter or slightly ahead, assuming their fire would intersect the plane's flight path. Often, this resulted in misses. The breakthrough came not from advanced technology or new weapons, but from a simple observation and careful study of gunnery statistics. Air combat instructors and engineers began to notice a pattern in successful hits. Rather than aiming directly at the center of the enemy plane, gunners were consistently more successful when they aimed slightly behind the target. At first, this seemed counterintuitive. How could aiming behind a target improve accuracy? The answer lay in the interplay between speed, distance, and the trajectory of bullets. In practice, bullets do not travel instantaneously. Even the powerful .50 caliber rounds used by U.S. gunners had a measurable travel time. Against fast-moving aircraft, this meant that a round fired directly at where a fighter appeared in the sights would often arrive too late, passing harmlessly through empty sky where the enemy had already moved. By aiming behind the target, gunners were compensating for this time lag. This technique, which came to be known as trailing, effectively allowed the bullets and the moving aircraft to converge at the same point in space. The concept was deceptively simple, but implementing it required rigorous training and a change in mindset. For gunners trained for months to aim straight at their targets, adjusting to aim behind a fighter felt unnatural. It required understanding the speed and trajectory of both the enemy and one's own aircraft, as well as the ballistics of the weapon. It was a mental and mechanical challenge compounded by the chaos of combat, where a single error could be fatal. To make trailing practical, the USAAF introduced a combination of training techniques and mechanical innovations. Gunners practiced on ground-based moving targets, learning to track them while leading or trailing appropriately. Simulators and mock-ups allowed trainees to fire at projected aircraft paths, refining their instincts. Perhaps most importantly, instructors emphasized that gunners should not focus solely on the enemy's apparent position but on its projected path. By predicting where the enemy would be when the bullets arrived, gunners could make their fire more effective. One of the most significant aids in this transformation was the development of the Sperry gunsight, an advanced optical device that projected a reticle onto a glass screen, compensating for bullet drop and aircraft motion. This sight allowed gunners to adjust their aim dynamically, giving them a visual representation of where they should aim to hit a moving target. Paired with the trailing technique, it dramatically increased the effectiveness of bomber defenses. A gunner no longer had to rely purely on instinct. The combination of training and technology provided a scientifically grounded method to hit enemy fighters. The results were remarkable. After implementing trailing techniques and the use of advanced sights, bomber crews reported a sudden and significant increase in kills. In some cases, air gunners doubled their effectiveness, shooting down twice as many enemy aircraft as before. Statistical analyses of mission reports showed that gunners who mastered trailing were not only more lethal but also less likely to waste ammunition. In a war where logistics were critical and every round mattered, this was a substantial advantage. But the impact went beyond mere numbers. Morale among bomber crews, particularly gunners, improved dramatically. Early in the war, many crews returned from missions traumatized and demoralized, feeling helpless against agile enemy fighters. By giving gunners a reliable method to defend themselves, the trailing technique restored confidence. Crews could trust that their defensive fire was not wasted and that, even in the chaos of a fighter attack, they could make a difference. The success of the technique also influenced tactical doctrine. Formation flying, for instance, became more sophisticated. Bombers could rely on overlapping fields of fire, with gunners trained to cover specific angles and distances, maximizing the use of trailing. Coordinated defensive fire made it more dangerous for German fighters to approach, forcing them into less effective attack runs and reducing losses for the Allies. In essence, a simple change in aiming philosophy had cascading effects on the entire air combat strategy of the USAAF. The story of how gunners learned to aim behind the target also highlighted the importance of observation and adaptation in warfare. Many military innovations during World War II were reactive, born out of necessity rather than premeditated strategy. Engineers and instructors meticulously analyzed combat reports, noting patterns in successes and failures. From these observations, they devised solutions that were sometimes counterintuitive, like trailing fire, yet profoundly effective. It was a lesson in humility for commanders and crews alike. The enemy would always challenge assumptions, and survival depended on the ability to learn and adapt quickly. Historical accounts emphasize that this change was not merely technical but psychological. Gunners had to unlearn deeply ingrained instincts. Early in training, they were taught to aim at the target, not behind it. Accepting the trailing method required trust in the science behind ballistics and motion, as well as faith in one's training. Anecdotes from veteran gunners often describe the first successful kills using the trailing technique as revelatory, almost miraculous. Many recalled the shock of seeing rounds connect with targets that had previously seemed untouchable, a validation of both their skill and the ingenuity of their instructors. The method also underscored the principle of relative motion in physics. In many ways, the aerial gunnery of World War II was an applied lesson in Newtonian mechanics. Bullets traveled along a parabolic trajectory, enemy aircraft moved at high velocity, and bomber gunners had to solve the problem of interception in real time. The trailing technique provided a practical application of these principles, turning theoretical physics into life-saving strategy. In fact, some military historians argue that this represents one of the clearest examples of scientific reasoning directly impacting battlefield outcomes during the war. The adaptation of trailing also influenced post-war aerial combat and gunnery training. While jet aircraft and missiles eventually replaced propeller-driven planes and machine guns, the underlying concept of leading or lagging shots to compensate for relative motion remained central to air combat. Modern fighter pilots, drone operators, and even tank crews still apply the same fundamental principle: understand where the target will be, not just where it is. In this sense, the lessons learned by U.S. gunners during World War II continue to shape military tactics decades later. It is worth noting that the German Luftwaffe and other Axis powers eventually recognized the effectiveness of trailing fire and similar predictive techniques. However, by the time such methods were widely adopted elsewhere, the USAAF had already gained a significant advantage in bomber survivability and aircrew confidence. Trailing contributed not only to the physical defense of bombers but also to the strategic momentum of the Allied air campaign. With more effective gunners, formations could penetrate deeper into enemy territory, sustain longer missions, and inflict greater damage on critical targets. In addition to combat effectiveness, the story of trailing highlights the human dimension of warfare. Gunners were often young men, barely out of their teens, facing the extreme stress of high-altitude combat over hostile territory. Many lacked prior experience with firearms or military service. By giving them a practical, scientifically grounded technique, instructors and engineers empowered these individuals to perform beyond what natural intuition alone would have allowed. Trailing became not just a method of aiming but a tool of survival, transforming fear into competence and uncertainty into calculated action. Moreover, the adoption of trailing illustrates a broader theme in military innovation: the interplay between technology and human adaptation. While advanced sights and aircraft design provided the tools, it was human ingenuity, observation, and learning that made the difference. The technique itself was simple in principle but required careful integration into training, equipment, and tactics. Without the willingness of gunners and instructors to embrace a counterintuitive approach, the potential advantages might have remained unrealized. The influence of trailing was felt throughout the strategic bombing campaigns over Europe and the Pacific. In Europe, formations of B-17s and B-24s could more confidently face Luftwaffe attacks, reducing losses and increasing the effectiveness of bombing runs on factories, railways, and military installations. In the Pacific, gunners aboard B-25 Mitchells and other aircraft used similar techniques against Japanese fighters, contributing to air superiority and the protection of naval and ground forces. The method became a standard part of USAAF gunnery doctrine, codified in manuals, illustrated in training films, and passed down from veteran to novice. Beyond the immediate wartime impact, the story of trailing carries lessons for modern military thought and civilian problem-solving alike. It demonstrates the power of observation, adaptation, and willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. By carefully analyzing patterns of success and failure, USAAF instructors identified a hidden principle: aiming behind the target, that transformed outcomes in a life-and-death environment. This principle, simple yet profound, exemplifies the ingenuity that often emerges under pressure and the importance of applying theory to practice in complex, dynamic situations. In retrospect, the success of trailing represents a remarkable intersection of human ingenuity, scientific reasoning, and practical necessity. It is a story of ordinary men, faced with extraordinary danger, learning to turn the very physics of motion into a weapon. Through careful observation, rigorous training, and mechanical innovation, U.S. gunners overcame seemingly insurmountable challenges, doubling their effectiveness and fundamentally changing the dynamics of aerial combat. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of applied knowledge in the face of chaos. When historians examine the air campaigns of World War II, the technical details of aircraft, engines, and weapons often dominate the narrative. Yet the story of trailing reminds us that innovation is not only about machines but about people, about how understanding and adapting to the natural laws of motion can save lives, protect comrades, and tip the scales in a global conflict. By learning to aim behind the target, U.S. gunners not only improved their hit rates but also redefined what was possible in aerial warfare, demonstrating that even in the most desperate circumstances, observation, courage, and adaptation can produce extraordinary results. The legacy of this technique continues in modern military doctrine and training. From simulated combat in advanced flight trainers to real-world aerial engagements with supersonic jets, the principle remains the same. Successful engagement requires anticipation, prediction, and the skillful alignment of one's actions with the motion of the target. The gunners of the USAAF may have relied on .50 caliber bullets and optical sights, but the underlying lesson transcends technology. To succeed, one must think ahead, measure carefully, and sometimes aim not at what is, but at what will be. In conclusion, the story of why U.S. gunners began aiming behind their targets is not merely a technical anecdote. It is a profound example of learning under pressure, the application of physics in extreme conditions, and the human capacity for adaptation. By observing patterns, embracing counterintuitive methods, and refining training techniques, the USAAF transformed the effectiveness of its gunners, saving countless lives and contributing decisively to the air war over Europe and the Pacific. The principle of trailing fire, born in the skies over battlefields teeming with danger, endures as a testament to ingenuity, courage, and the enduring power of applied knowledge.